Hello and welcome to GuyLogicGaming. My name is Temko and this is a belated review for Realpolitiks. Developed by Jujubee S.A and published by 1C Company, it is a contemporary setting, so that's current day setting, political grand strategy game. You select a country or an empire and go from there in a variety of methods and ways to win the scenario, win the scene, or just get to the end by building your massive empire in a variety of ways and methods. Now, this game is much in the vein of things like Europa Universalis and other games like that, but due to its contemporary setting and due to its political era style, it is actually a very unique set of rules and constrictions the game has set upon itself. So have they done a good job or not? Well, we're gonna find out about that in a second. Before we do that though, let's go ahead and dive into some game options, talk a little bit about a PC build and all the good stuff like that. As always, if you are not so inclined to join us on that journey, there is a link at the top of the description below, skipping you straight to the gameplay segment. Options wise, this is somewhat of a disappointment. There is a sound and music slider. There's also no extra sliders for extra effects such as background effects or FX effects, which you could designate under sound, but it's not really the same thing. Also, no master volume does make this a little bit trickier to manage. The gameplay settings are equally bare bones with a autosave and a show hints. There is no configuration settings, UI settings, icon settings, flag settings, or anything you have come to expect from these types of games in this menu, and that is a tremendous shame. If you take a look at some other games like Europa Universalis that are sort of inhabiting the same sphere of gameplay like this game, they have a ton of configurable settings to improve your own gaming experience in terms of UI, in terms of visible clarity, and this game does none of those, so that is definitely a mark against the title. Lastly, graphics wise, the game has one setting and one setting alone, and that is your resolution setting. The game doesn't have anything other than full screen or windowed mode, which is okay. It's not great because I do prefer full screen windowed when I have it available, but it's not the end of the world. The game does support a nice range of resolutions. The reason the game doesn't have a lot of graphical options is also understandable. It's mostly played on a gigantic map of the world, and there are no real graphics to speak of. Now, in a game maybe like Hearts of Iron, where you are playing a lot on the map itself, but there's also 3D units moving around on the map and there's lots of these effects in screen that might affect the FPS or performance in general and might need to be turned off or disabled if you don't like them. There I can expect some of these graphical settings. In this case though, a lack of graphical options isn't the end of the world, and there are a couple of things like environments and trees that the game does render aloud, which do create a little bit of a more dynamic nature to a very flat map. Otherwise you're looking at something that Total War did about a decade ago, as opposed to something more modern that does have the computing power to render those extra little bits here and there to spice up the place, so to say. Lastly, we have some language settings, and the game does have quite a few languages available in it, which is good and very helpful. Though, if you're playing in English, that doesn't really matter. Talking about the PC performance, it is actually really stable. The game does have a few bugs here and there and some balance issues, but those aren't really related to the PC performance in so much. The game runs a stable 60 FPS and fairly honest, even late stages when there's a lot of things the AI has to calculate and move forward with every turn, where games like Civilization 6 suddenly have a minute plus turn times. This game doesn't do any of that and stays exceedingly stable. No complaints whatsoever about this game's performance and polish. So enough about all of that, let's go ahead and dive into some gameplay and talk all about that and see whether or not this game lives up to the idea of a contemporary grand strategy with a political setting. So gameplay wise, Realpolitiks puts you in this big map with a little empire and lets you go forth and see what you want to do. Now there are a couple of scenarios that try to sort of point you in the right direction, and depending on the scenario and country you select, you have a different variety of objectives you are set to complete before winning that scenario. Overall, a pretty decent range of things you can do or initially in the game. Though, obviously games like Europa Universalis have a much larger pool, but those games are also been out for several years and have had a ton of patching and updates over the years. This game hasn't had that luxury, so it is starting off with a much smaller set of things you can do in terms of scenarios. You can still join in and do whatever you want like any other type of political side game. The second note to make is that this is a contemporary setting, political focused game. This means that certain things you might expect if you like things like Hearts of Iron and lots of detailed troop control and troop movement does not exist in this game and you should not be expecting it to be. And because the game is a contemporary setting, lots of the things you notice in the game are based on real world politics. It's important to note though that this also poses a problem. because the game is sort of in two minds about what it wants to achieve, in my opinion. On one end, it's a very entry-level type of game with not too much depth. It tries to provide all the other things many of these other games do in this very genre, but it does so in a very limited level. A good example is a stock exchange. You can start one up, you can invite different empires or different nations to your stock exchange, and they can contribute to your own income overall. But as a player, you cannot get invited by an AI, and in many cases, the stock exchange doesn't really do much of anything. It doesn't help improve your relations in any tangible way with these nations. It doesn't bind them to you in terms of political decisions or anything like that. All it really does is add a little bit of income to your overall income. Yeah, sure, that's welcome, but that's not really a stock exchange in the current sense. It's more of a little sort of corporation that you sort of trade goods with one another. And the same really goes for things like exporting and importing. There are projects that do this sort of thing, but they are very flat. Oh, you can now export minerals and you get imported money for this extra set of exported minerals. There is no actual depth or negotiation or anything of the sort for trade agreements. The additional layer of depth just isn't here. And this is a very valid criticism of the title, because apparently developers have gone ahead and said, okay, we want a very smooth, very streamlined experience in terms of UI, in terms of interaction, in terms of alerts, notifications, everything around it is very streamlined, but we just don't have the time to develop some of these systems to the depth they need to be very, very good. They're simply sort of placeholders for what could be here in the near future, provided they obviously keep updating the game. Now, to start off, I do want to iterate that this game is very polished. It runs a smooth 60 FPS at any given time. There is no slowdowns or anything of the sort later down the line, which games like Civilization 6 have massive issues with. As soon as the AI levels and AI turns becomes more complex, your CPU sort of bottlenecks the entire thing and turns can take upwards of a minute. In this game, that is not the case, and everything moves on smoothly forward and forward every tick of the cycle. Very, very solid and good overall. I did not notice any hitching or stuttering or anything of the sort, even on the higher gameplay speeds. Compliments to developers on this. This is a very solid PC release. Another thing they've done really well is the project system. Now, before we dive into all the other things the game is made up of, it's important to note that how you develop your nations and what sort of things influence your development and how you can sort of focus your empire in a specific direction. Because the way the game is done politically is that there's three primary ways of ruling your nation. You can do so democratically with an authoritarian type of overall politics, or you can do it with a totalitarian rule. And depending on the way you design policies and depending on certain things you implement, you sort of slide up and down on this scale. And depending on the scale you're on, you may have different types of actions or different effects you have in the game that affect what you can do. If you're a democratic elect and you get voted out of office, well, there's really nothing you can do. You do not have the power you would have in a totalitarian government where you could kill and imprison all your opponents that are political and walk away scot-free. So there are definite consequences depending on the type of steering you do for your empire. On top of that, you also have things like your political growth, or things like fighting unemployment, or things like improving your army, or energy, or economy, or infrastructure. All of these things have different effects. Some of these effects may be as simple as adding point scores to your empire in preparation for things like further down the line, improving your economic sector, improving your diplomatic relations, improving your spy system. All these things have different effects, and you unlock them and upgrade them as you would in most other games. The twist here is that some of them influence directly on certain things you do as an empire. So if you enact a doctrine, for example, that forces in conscription of women and children, you are going to be a much more totalitarian government because it's conscription, it's forceful, and different nations are going to react differently to that, and also it's going to change different policies depending on the way you interact these things. So your people might get less happy, or import or export might slow down, or things like unemployment might drop or rise, and these things do matter a lot. So it's very important to only enact projects that you feel are beneficial to your empire, even if some of these projects are very good for a certain different reason. Socialized healthcare might be really good for the longevity of your people and population growth, but it also results in people having more say in power in what happens, and that might influence your totalitarian government if you're going that direction. It's a very good set of balances, checks, and responses to things that are going on. Pretty solid. Also, all these projects, depending on the project, have an upkeep cost. Keeping up a propaganda machine to keep going and going and going costs a lot of capital. So if you have enabled this project, you're going to have to pay an upkeep for it every month. And you can disable it obviously down the line if you don't need it anymore for whatever reason, but if you have it enabled, you pay upkeep for that. So that here too has a set of checks and balances. Overall, the project system is very much the strength of this game in a variety of ways and methods. It allows upgrades, it allows innovation, it allows specialization, and it allows you to try out different things for a variety of reasons. But there are two other things that drag the game down quite a bit. Because if everything was like the project system, this game would be phenomenal in almost every regard. Sadly, the project system is the highlight of the game. Secondly, diplomacy in the game is very, very shallow. A good example is a stock exchange, where you can invite nations to your stock exchange, but other AIs cannot invite you to theirs. You cannot join an existing stock exchange, so the only way to create a stock exchange is to set one up and invite nations to you. And the only way to join a diplomatic bloc is also to create one and not get invited. So this means everything is forced for now in the player to expand and initiate these things, and you can't get swept in certain things like the other allies around you are doing. There's nothing of that sort. It's not that there's a big empire like Russia has a full set of control over certain regions, and if you want to join in on that fun because you're friends with them, you can't. You have to start your own and sort of entice them to join you, which is really, really backwards and weird in my opinion. But this does highlight a major problem with the game AI, and that is that the AI is extremely inconsistent. Now, part of it is the way it deviates from real-world actions. A good example is that suddenly Mexico would win the space race, or Japan would be a fascist empire. These things that don't make a lot of sense if you consider current-day political climate and the fact that this game is being played in the near future. This doesn't make a lot of sense in that regard. Obviously, we have no idea what the gameplay or future would look like 200 years from now, but it's really strange to have a contemporary setting political aspect with current day nations and ethnicities and different ideologies simply move forward 200 years. You expect these different nations and ideologies that are existing in current day gameplay and in the current day political sphere to sort of translate in that regard as well. Otherwise, you might just well call them everything else except what they currently are. Really strange to see Croatia with current day borders 200 years in the future behaving very different than a current day Croatia would. That's just a little bit of inconsistency in terms of the AI, and that is something that consistently moves forward through the game. So that is a little bit strange, not unovercomable because the game developers can patch this in a variety of different ways. But the fact that, for example, trying to maintain positive relations with different AI around you, allies or neutrals that you're trying to sort of bring to your side and trying to convince to trying to vote for your UN resolutions is really tricky because it's really hard to get AI anywhere from 40 to 60%. Outside of that range is really hard. Lower, you want to do that because you want to cultivate a war with them or try to entice them to attack you so you can retaliate without a warmonger penalty. But higher than that, you want to entice them to your block, maybe join your allyship, maybe be friends with you so they can gang up on another enemy. Both of these extremes are really hard to maintain in any way, and that is a damn shame because you can't really maintain good set of allies. There's also no way to control your block in any significant manner. Maintaining a block takes a lot of energy and there's no real benefit to it because all of it you're doing is sort of creating a small alliance that defends one another when under attack. But because your AI around you doesn't really evolve that well in terms of warfare in the early to mid game, the only real benefit of blocks is way down the line when you are a warmonger yourself and you have a ton of enemies going on for your throat because you have internal diplomacy, politics and stuff like that. Then the AI blocks come sort of useful. So again, this is the secondary issue with the game. It is the lack of depth in some of these other systems. Diplomacy being flawed in terms of that you might be a warmonger and everything short of being literally Stalin or Hitler or Mao might not actually be that bad the deal for you because the UN doesn't give a shit. And that is a major problem because if you keep attacking small nations, other nations around it aren't going to ally up and defend themselves. They just sort of wait around and see what happens to their ally, which is really, really flawed. Onward, there is one more note here to talk about, and that is the warfare system. Now, as you can see in the video, I'm currently trying to start a war with Veneto, which is obviously current-day Venice. And in the meantime, I'm going to be attacked by Austria, because I have a very low rating with them. And they see I'm in a war, they sort of capitalize on that. Pretty good AI response, right? Except they don't really matter, they just want a certain region of me. And there's no way to interact with AI in any way. Now, outside of the actual warfare itself, which I feel is a very solid system for the political ideology of this game, because it's not Hearts of Iron, it does not want you to minimize and maximize and create war lines and try to control units individually. It sort of wants you to set a set army, send it out, and then do missions to improve your war score with an enemy, and once that war score is done, you sort of take over the region. The problem is that exact war score, because if you don't have a war score of 100, either win or lose, the AI is not going to let do anything. And that is really, really annoying, because if you're attacking an enemy empire and you have a 90% war score, and they have no army left at all, you still need to get 100% war score before they're even willing to surrender. A white piece is out of the question. It's either complete victory or total loss. There is no way to negotiate with the AI, and this is the flaw with the war system. Not so much that the war itself is a very simplistic affair, because that is what the game is about. You start a war, you sort of micromanage it a little bit, and then you pause the game, do your other stuff, do diplomacy, do stock exchange, do internal upgrades, and then you pay attention to the war again for a little bit, do some decision making, and then go back to whatever you were doing. Multi-manage your empire. Problem is that unless you have 100% war score, it doesn't really matter what your empire is doing, because all you'll be doing is the war score, and that is very annoying. Secondly is the balance in the game. Different empires, even if you outnumber them immensely, you can have a 4-1 victory against them in terms of sheer number and economy. They can still hold out for a ridiculous amount of time in terms of warfare, because you need to do so many missions step by step. And because the way the game's warfare is structured in a very simplistic rock, paper, scissors method, means that if you don't have supremacy in all three regards, you might not actually win the war. You might lose a war even with massive superior numbers, training, economy, and overall everything you might have, simply because your rock, paper, scissors doesn't have the necessary amount of rocks. And that is definitely quite frustrating. So overall, while the war method isn't bad in itself, the fact that it's flawed in terms of war score and the fact that it's flawed in terms of being very, very strict in its rock, paper, scissors do reduce the enjoyment I have with warfare within this game. So we've talked a little bit about diplomacy and how that interacts with things, and the very excellent project system. And tying all of that into the AI also really brings it together, which means that the game is very clean presentation, a very solid UI. I doubt I've seen a better UI for this type of game in years. Very clean, all the information is always available. You can press and click and filter on basically any level you need to get the information you want. Problem is that developers have clearly focused immense amounts of time and effort into getting this presentation as real as they can in that regard. But because they've done that, they've let system complexity and system depth fall to the wayside. As I said earlier in the review, if all the systems in the game were as deep and rich as the project system, which is immensely deep and rich, then this game would be a phenomenal addition to any person that enjoys grand strategy of any kind. As it is, it's a very nice entry-level game, and lots of patching, updates, DLCs, and expansions could make it a very good game in the future, because its core problem isn't fundamental design decisions, it's just features that have not been fleshed out enough. Then, for now, I say this game isn't as great as it could be, and that is a damn shame, because the potential is here. A good example is the way diplomacy works in terms of spies and allies. You can increase relations, you can help an enemy or potential ally to increase relations with them. You could even send spies to destabilize them, and all of these things are available, but they're very limited, because unless the AI is doing that to you, there is no feedback to you unless something happens. And if you're doing certain aspects on the AI score, you might send a spy in, that spy might fail, the empire is going to hate you, but overall there's no consequence. If you're having a war, the UN might give you a warning, but there's going to be no consequence. If you're in massive debt and you pay a pittance in terms of interest on that debt, nobody's going to care. It's not going to infect your economy, it's not going to infect your income, outside of the interest obviously. It's not going to affect anything really effectively. And all of these things combined really mean you can power on, get a massive depth, get a massive boost in the early game, hold back a little bit, crash that depth really fast because you're so far ahead of the rest, and you get a massive point score bonus every time the game cycles through a point score. So that means your human index development, which is some of the criteria you need to do things like improve projects and allows for other things as well, just isn't there. No matter. You can just ignore that for now, push forward, get that boost from being the first in the score points, and then sell back your debt. And there's a variety of these gimmicky approaches you can take because the game systems don't account for these extra steps people take and game the system. And this is the fundamental issue with the game. Yes, it's a very polished, yes, it's a very, very nice experience as an entry-level game. But if you're a bit more experienced, the game falls flat on its face fairly fast. So overall, Realpolitiks is a nice, solid game with a nice, solid gameplay scope, but all its systems are quite shallow and don't provide a lot of enjoyment if you are more of a veteran player for the genre. If you are a new player to the genre, and if you want to sort of dip your toes in the water, this might be a very excellent title for you to start out in before you start branching off in things like Hearts of Iron or Europa Universalis, or other games like that obviously. But for now, it's really hard for me to universally recommend this title. It's not bad, but it's also not great. And I hope the developers are actively patching and fixing this game, as they are clearly doing, because the version I'm reviewing here is version 1.3.3, which is an update that changed a lot of balance issues with the game I had originally into much more manageable nodes. There's still a lot of work to be done on a variety of things, from AI to economy to internal country development, and I do hope developers keep at it. In the meantime, a solid entry-level game with a lot of shallow systems that are flawed in some regard. So if you are interested in Realpolitiks, the game is available over on Steam, and there's a link in the description below for you to check it out. And if you like this video, just press that like button below. If you didn't like this video, there's a dislike button for exactly that purpose, and leave a comment. Tell us what you think. Tell us what you liked. Tell us what you didn't like. We want to hear back from all of you. And if you want to see more content like this on the channel, just press that subscribe button down below and we will deliver. And until then, I wish you a good day, and until next time, right here on GuyLogicGaming.